Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, we can see that. Fabulous. Okay, so often when I am writing, when I come to a point where I'm stuck, I will take myself for a walk, and that tends to get the ideas flowing again. Um, I've kind of just put a little title there, The Frightening Fens. With it being October, we thought it would be a suitable time to talk about some of the stories I write because they broadly fit into the genre of horror. Sometimes it's what you call quiet horror, where there's just a suggestion of something slightly creepy, slightly sinister going on. Some of them are a little more supernatural. And a lot of the ideas come from the local area and from some of the folklore. And a lot of that folklore isn't something I've necessarily had to seek out. Growing up in the area, you hear these stories. I was very lucky in as far as both of my grandfathers were incredible storytellers. They would just spend hours telling a tale about something that happened to them or somebody they knew or just a story that they had heard and they would pass it on. So I always grew up with kind of a lot of these ideas. Um, and just on the screen now, these are just some pictures which I've taken over the last year or so, walks where I've just taken off from Witchford, and within kind of 5 minutes of that, I can be on a trail like this, just kind of wandering, which really helps to get the ideas flowing again, just taking a nice peaceful stroll, seeing that landscape. And some of the novels I've written, which I'll talk about later, really feed on this idea. So the main picture at the bottom there, where we've got that long straight drove there in particular, um, is something I'll be talking about. But quite often you'll then turn a corner and you'll find yourself somewhere a little more sinister, a little kind of covered over, where there's plenty of shadows. And then the mind starts to wander. What could be lurking around the corner? What might you hear rustling through the vegetation? And something which I always find such an absolute joy is Ely Cathedral lingering in the background there. I just if you'll sometimes come across a gap in a hedge and you might see just kind of a hint of corrugated iron that suggests there's some kind of farm building there or something hidden, and it makes you think, well, what could be going on in a place like that? And then you just turn your head slightly and then you see that magnificent medieval building in the background. And I think there's that great kind of contrast between the two, the magnificence of that cathedral, which has stood for hundreds and hundreds of years now, compared to something like we see on the screen now, something put together for a certain purpose, and it will remain there for a significant amount of time, but it's certainly not designed in the same way. It's not the same spectacle, but I really do like kind of your corrugated iron, the twisted bits of metal, and just the shadows and what could be going on. And the first novel I wrote, Dead Branches, was about a character returning to Fens. It had a dual timeline. So the bulk of the story was set when the main character, Thomas Tilbrook, was 10 or 11 years old, and his best friend goes missing. But there's also a present day thread in which he's returning home for the first time since that summer when he was 10, 11. His father is dying, and it's a cause for him to kind of go back and reassess what happened in that summer. And we're talking kind of 30 years later at that point. And this is just a piece from the first chapter here. It's a long time since I thought of that summer. It's a long time since I thought of Little Mosswick and its network of droveways and ditches that were our secret trails around the village. Don't believe the myth that Fenland folk are somehow special, that they have an affinity with the soil and share some kind of secret knowledge. Don't believe there's an inherent goodness in that place. He's coming back here with a real bitterness about his past. But the pieces in the past that are set in 1990, you can see how much he loved this area. It was really interesting because this novel I wrote when I was doing my MA in creative writing, and I had an American tutor, and the word drove was alien to her. What's a drove? And to me, that was just a moment of absolute shock. It's a word I've heard frequently throughout my whole life. How can someone not know what a drove is? So that's why, because it's an American publisher, that's why it says specifically droveways there rather than just drove. And it's just kind of a fascinating idea that these are kind of the old paths used primarily to drive livestock when the seasons had changed to better land, basically. I always found that that was something that really kind of took me, that my language, where I've grown up, is not going to fit with everyone else. So working with an American publisher as well, I had to be conscious they wouldn't necessarily understand. This next part kind of feeds into that idea with the picture that we had before of the corrugated iron building hidden behind the hedges there. This is again in the present day part of the text, when kind of the bitter narrator, a bitter Thomas, is going back to this place. I gaze across the checkerboard of fields. It's all so open that it looks as if there's nowhere to hide. It looks as though you couldn't possibly have any secrets in a place like this. I know better, and as I scan the land, I spot a silo, deep ditches that would allow you to cross this landscape unseen, and half a dozen dilapidated barns, the corrugated iron roofs curling away from the rotting wooden beams. I know that not far from here is the river, where there are more places to hide or to be hidden, under bridges, in drainage pipes, and abandoned waterworks. And this is the kind of thing I would be kind of looking out for as I went on my walks, kind of signs of what's that in the distance? What's that hiding in that kind of shallow dip there? What's that building across the way? So I always find I'm always looking out for something when I'm walking. And now we come back to the contrast in that when the character is younger, this is now in 1990, his friend John has been missing for 2 or 3 days, and the children in the village, they have this idea that they know the droves, they know the paths around the village better than the police do. They don't know the area. And that came from my own kind of wandering as a child with friends. Where does this path lead to? What are you going to find down there? So after school, we talked. I can't quite see that because there's something in the way. So I'm going to start from the dialogue. We could follow the drove round the back of the school. He might have gone off that way, I said. As you pass behind the school, you can see into the staff room. We liked to mimic the teachers, make up their conversations. We each picked up long sticks as we started our walk, except for Andy, who plucked his nunchucks from his rucksack. Not long after, Liam thrust his stick over my shoulder, millimetres from my ear into an elderberry bush. Its leaves lurched towards me. There was nowhere to go. The man-eating plant would wrap its branches around my limbs and pull me into its mouth. Instead, with a slap of wings against branches, a flurry of feathers flew out, and 2 huge pigeons set off the sky, leaving me to tumble onto my backside. The main character in this is almost obsessed with horrific creatures. So he's studying a deck of top trumps cards, which have kind of horror characters in it. So he always imagines this is going to be a man-eating plant. This is going to be something horrible, but it's just pigeons that then fly out. And some of the folklore fed into what I was writing with one character. He was called Grandad Norman within the piece. And I was certainly thinking of kind of my own grandparents when I created this character. He always has stories to tell. He always is sharing kind of his knowledge of the Fens. So later, after we'd eaten and Dad had gone back, whoops. I'm going to start from the second line because again, the top one's off the screen for me. He'd earlier mentioned the black shuck and a shug monkey. "You've never heard of one?" he said, leaning back in surprise. "It's much like the black shuck in many ways." He must have seen the puzzlement on my face. "Don't tell me you've not heard of that either." I shook my head. "You've heard of people seeing giant black dogs which disappear, right?" There had been something about it on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries that I'd watched with John once. "It's much like one of those, but crossed with a monkey too." "Have you ever seen one?" I asked. Grandad leaned back and took a deep breath, as if he were about to launch into one of his epic stories. "No," he said. "Do you know anyone that has?" "Only that your dad reckoned he'd seen one that time." "Do you believe in them?" "I believe what I've seen with my own eye first of all, but that don't mean things I've not seen can't be true. I know there's a lot more out there than we could always make sense of, but what's to say that the shug monkey, the black shuck, and the fen tiger aren't the same type of thing?" I thought back to what had chased me the other day. Could that have been one of these things? Maybe the makers of the cards had collected these types of beasts together under the name Fiend, because there was such a range of different names from them. And if there were so many different accounts, there had to be some truth in it, didn't there? And with this piece, it really kind of made me think about where our folklore comes from, where our stories originate. So this is a picture taken in roughly, I think this is the one that was taken in the 1980s, of a supposed great cat in the Fen area. First spotted in Cottenham, and that was given the name the Fen tiger. But of course, the name the Fen tiger comes back to a much earlier period. That goes back to the time of the drainage of the Fens, and that group that were opposed to that drainage. So when we talk of Fen tigers, we expect that we could be talking about this group of rebels, essentially, that didn't want their way of life changing. They were used to living from the land through catching eels, through their eels, perhaps through wildfowl, through other such things. And if they changed the landscape, that would be taken away from them. So for then that same name, a Fen tiger, to be used for a giant cat that supposedly roams the area, it means it's got that kind of dual meaning to it. And it almost, I think today, if my children heard Fen tiger, they would think of a great cat rather than these rebels who didn't want to see progress. So I always think it's fascinating the way that something like that can change, and the way that we can use that phrase can alter. So hang on, that's not, there we go. With that text, it's very much based upon the kind of things that would be within a 10 or 11-year-old's imagination if they'd grown up in this kind of area. When I moved on to my second novel, which is more of a supernatural story, Is She Dead in Your Dreams? That has a character who is an outsider coming to the Fens for not necessarily the first time, he has an uncle that lives there, but he's coming for the first time to live there. And one of the things which I really appreciate living in this area is our sunsets. I think we get sunsets like nowhere else. Coming back to the comment about the mountains earlier, you can have a very nice sunset over a mountain, but you lose it very quickly. Here we get such beautiful skies, and I find that very inspirational. So this is the character Orwell witnessing one of the Fen sunsets for the first time. The sun was setting as they drove home, and the sky was suffused with colour. The clouds, a range of oranges, amalgamated with a kaleidoscope of purples, and the silhouettes of farmhouse and clusters of trees stood out on the horizon. The previous night, when he arrived in darkness, Orwell had not seen this beauty, had not understood that somewhere so flat and featureless could look so wondrous. But now, as he drove back towards the cottage, he felt the tiniest glimmer of hope break out of the dark vault inside him. The situation in this novel is that Orwell and his daughter Shelley, Orwell is a widower, they're having to fall on charity of an uncle and move into a dilapidated old farm cottage, an employee cottage. And with that comes a whole host of kind of folklore, myths, legends of the kind of things that we find in old houses. So here we have the shoes. Witches were believed to be attracted by human scent of a shoe. And after they entered one, they found themselves trapped, as their witches apparently unable to reverse. So if they go into a shoe, they can't get back out again. So commonly, these would be placed in a fireplace or above a door, sometimes beneath a floor, to ward off any kind of evil. And I'm going to read you the start of Dead Branches in a moment, where the character discovers these. But there's a couple of other very similar things which come into this. Now, these ones, witch bottles, witch jars, these are examples which were found in Suffolk, often within kind of spaces between walls under the floor. These would be placed. Sometimes they'd have something inside them. As it says here, folk magic contends that witch bottles protect against evil spirits and magical attack, and counteract spells cast by witches. Counter magical devices, the purpose of which is to draw in and trap harmful intentions directed at their owners. And then we have the mummified cats. Cats have always been associated with witchcraft for centuries, because they are tied to the supernatural in the folklore of various countries. They're often placed in areas where home owners felt they could be under threat. The roofs, fireplaces, places they think a witch could possibly come in and attract them. And over recent years, there have been countless examples of these witch bottles, mummified cats found in houses all around East Anglia. And in Northamptonshire, they're keeping a log of all of these findings and trying to collect as many of them as they can. So I'm going to read from you now the opening of Is She Dead in Your Dreams, in which they discover one of these shoes. Orwell heard the scream from outside the dilapidated cottage. Shelley's shriek resonated through the crumbling walls and out of the door to where Orwell was lifting another box from the car. His daughter's dire cries had punctuated Orwell's days ever since he was sentenced to life as a widower. In the 5 months following Callie's death, Shelley would frequently scream until she was incapable of making any further sound, her throat raw and her eyes bloodshot. Eventually, she'd collapse on the spot in exhaustion, sweaty hair pasted to her face, her skin ice cold, but momentarily exercised of rage. When Orwell saw Shelley, he realised this scream was different. This was not the sort of scream the grief counsellor had called a natural mechanism for a teenage girl coping with the death of her mother, nor was this a scream of anguish. This was a scream of fear. Typically, when she screamed, Shelley's wide eyes stared into space as if she saw beyond her own reality and into another world. She balled her hands into fists and her arms lay dead straight by her sides. This time, however, her hands were crossed over her heart and her eyes had narrowed, fixed upon something. "What is it?" Shelley asked in a hoarse whisper, her face drained of colour. She backed away until she touched the opposite wall. "Is it a foot?" Orwell gazed up. The soiled wallpaper curled away from the ceiling as if trying to flee in disgust. Something protruded from a gap between the wall and the ceiling. Orwell tried to focus his tired eyes upon the shape. Did it wiggle? Was something alive up there? He leaned in closer. An ancient shoe. It looked like a moccasin, the leather a blemished beige colour. He'd read about this when he'd researched an article on superstition, which he'd not yet had published. He placed his hand on Shelley's back. It's okay, sweetheart. It's nothing to worry about. What is it? Shelley's eyes were still fixed upon it. It's a shoe, an old superstition. They keep demons away. Get rid of it, Shelley said, her voice shrill, not far from the pitch of her screams. That's where I'm going to leave the reading. Alas, I'm sure you can guess what does happen. The shoe is removed, hence that protection from evil is gone, and that allows the supernatural elements in the story to flock in there. And that shoe becomes significant again at the very end. The story also features one of these, a hagstone. And amazingly, a relative of mine some years ago moved into an old house in Rickinghall in Suffolk. And within one of their rooms, they found one of these hanging from a piece of string tied to one of the beams above. The idea of this is that the small hole lets through good fortune and good wishes, but bad luck, bad thoughts, the evil things, they're too big to fit through, so they become stuck. But it was very strange to find one in situ within this house hanging there where it'd been for a very long time. And the owners of the house did suggest that that particular room always did feel particularly cold. Whether it's anything to do with that or because it was a room without heating, I couldn't tell you. Moving on. Something else we tend to get in this area, and something else of great inspiration, is that during the winter, the floods do come. This is Sutton Galt, the road which often passes from one side to the other, was completely impassable on this day. And this one is, it's one of two places. It's either in Witchford or it's out towards Littleport. I think it's the second one. And the third picture here, we have, again, coming back to our marvellous cathedral and the reflection in the water, because my third novel, Normal, is perhaps less based upon folklore, but water is a very important aspect of it. It starts with a character coming to in the water, and he's struggling to kind of to the bank, and when he gets there, he realizes that it's the wrong season. He has no memory whatsoever of the previous 7 months, which is normal, which ties into a couple of ideas. So the first two novels, Dead Branches and Is She Dead in Your Dreams, have ideas about people going missing in them. For this one, I kind of turned that on its head. What if people are coming back? Where have they been? If they're coming back from somewhere and they've got this lack of knowledge about what has happened. And when I was thinking about that, I stumbled upon The Green Children of Woolpit, an absolutely fascinating story, and one which goes back to the 12th century. Something which I hadn't read before. So when I come across this a couple of years ago when I was plotting the novel, it really was quite an inspiration. So two children with green skin appeared as if from nowhere in Woolpit in Suffolk. They claimed to be a brother and sister of normal appearance, with the exception that their skin was green. The language that they spoke in wasn't recognised by any of the people of the 12th century Woolpit. And the only thing they'd eat was raw broad beans. Something I love about kind of folklore stories is when you've got a very specific detail in there. There's something about that helps it feel much more genuine. If there's just one very concrete piece of information, and for me, it's that. Eventually, they learned to eat other food, and that green color of theirs faded away. The boy didn't live for long, but the sister did, and she adjusted, and she learned to speak English. And then her claim, when she could speak the language, was that she came from St. Martin's Land, which is a subterranean world inhabited by green people. Now, while normal doesn't contain any green people, as the novel progresses, the idea of there being a subterranean world is something which grows within that piece. And coming back to the water, it's, as I said, set in a very similar area to the other two texts. Imagine there are villages somewhere between Littleport and Southery on the River Wissey. Normal takes place imagining that they're building a new community there and trying to shift the path of a river channel. So they're doing a lot of excavation. And this idea that in doing this, you can uncover something quite scary comes about. Now, witches. Our region was certainly not alone in this, but there were a great many people in the late 1500s, early 1600s executed for witchcraft. Let's have a sip of drink. Among those, the witches of Warboys, they were quite early in the period of executing witches. And this is an account of how they were able to prove that Alice Samuel, one of those so-called witches of Warboys, was a witch. He found upon the body of the old woman, Alice Samuel, a little lump of flesh, in manner sticking out as if it had been a teat, to the length of 1/2 inch, which both he and his wife, perceiving at the first sight thereof, meant not to disclose, because it was adjoining so secret a place which was not decent to be seen, yet in the end not willing to conceal so strange a matter, and decently covering the privy place a little above which it grew, they made open show thereof unto diverse that stood by. Just this idea that if somebody has some kind of skin tag or growth, that can be used as proof that one is a witch. And over the years, the idea that a fen witch would be somewhat different from the witches of drier parts of the country has spread. And this definition here, strangely, comes from one set of rules or creature definitions from a Dungeons and Dragons game. So you can see how the idea of the Fens and what goes on infiltrates all sorts of things. So this creature appears to be as a female humanoid with one nostril, webbed feet and hands, and fiery red eyes. Her body is cloaked in tattered robes of grey or brown. Her hands end in razor-sharp claws, and her hair is usually long and unkempt. Now, I think most of us accept that those who were executed for witchcraft were either people who were falsely excused as some kind of revenge plot, or quite simply healers, people who had some kind of knowledge of the properties of plants, and particularly within the Fens, where it wouldn't necessarily be easy to travel to see somebody who had accepted medical knowledge. You would go see somebody more local who was a healer. But that could possibly lead to allegations of mistreatment and wrongdoing when things went wrong. And exploring the idea of witch was what my novella from earlier this year, The Fen Witch of Goosefeather Split, was about. I'm going to start by just reading the opening description of that witch, which comes to a character in a dream. This novella was really written just because there's a thematic link of people going missing or being returned across the first 3 novels. And the novella is kind of the leftovers. It's kind of, I wasn't quite done with that idea. There are other things I wanted to bring into it. So it's another kind of missing person story. It's another kind of story about somebody returning to the Fens. But this character also tends to return in his dreams with great regularity. So I'm just going to read the description of the witch that appears in his dream. For years, every time I closed my eyes, I saw her rise from the marsh at Goosefeather Split. Nightmares have augmented the memory, allowed me to study in detail that which I witnessed in reality for only seconds. When she rises, vines twist around her as if the swamp itself is sentient, its tentacles reluctant to release her. Filthy water rushes from her body in a cascade and continues to drip from the dark and sodden rags she wears. And as the vines let her go, she takes her first stuttering steps. Wet earth squelches beneath her feet, and her webbed toes sink into the thick, dark mud where nothing grows. Her fingers too are webbed, and as she holds one hand towards me, I see the fingernails long, sharp, and deadly, like talons. Her face, and I'm always thankful for this, is covered by a mass of thick black hairs that clings to the contours and comes together below her chin into a point from which water continues to run. A guttural noise bubbles in her throat, and I hear only one word: go. So that's the witch aspect of this. The second part is the split goose feather, and here it's used as a name for a place. So another really kind of known custom. The split goose feather. So it's, as it says here, in the Fen country, if one carried a split goose feather, you are entitled to the help and protection of Fenmen in times of trouble. And it said, Oliver Cromwell, he was from Huntingdon, he would know of this legend, as was King Charles I. And King Charles I was on the run from Cromwell's troops. He was being chased from Snow Hill in Norfolk across the Little Port Fens, and he and his fellow cavaliers escaped by showing split goose feathers to the local Roundhead soldiers. So the place in my novella, Goosefeather Split, is named because it's allegedly the place that this event took place. Apparently Cromwell he sided with his soldiers and said that they did the right thing. It's better to let the king escape than for such an old custom to be broken. It's also said that when they did catch up with King Charles sometime later, that he still had one of these split goose feathers, and he had it taken to Cromwell the night before his execution. And it said that Cromwell spent the night deliberating whether he would go ahead with the execution or not. And as we know, he chose to do so. And it's such a good story that I had to include it in something. It just tied in with this kind of idea of it being kind of the same kind of place where this Fen witch would dwell, and a small community is under her thrall. There's so much kind of more which I can see working its way into stories in the future and kind of future plots here. So stories of the Lantern. I recently wrote something based in Wicken Fen, and then realised actually the story of those mysterious ghostly lights, the Lantern Men, could tie in that very well. Similar to the Will-o'-the-Wisp idea. There's the legend of Tom Hickathrift, who's both described as a one who took on and defeated a giant. I believe this is supposed to be the Wisbeach giant. He's fighting in the image there. He is sometimes painted as being a giant himself, or just one of giant strength. I did write a story about a giant earlier this year, I think, which featured on a podcast, and tying in on those ideas was something that I was certainly thinking about. Just going back into history, Um, Eels are always kind of a fascinating part, and there's lots that can be done with that idea. There was a recent collection by Daisy Johnson called Fen, which was all stories set in the kind of the Fenland area, and they were all kind of stories of strange goings on. But before that, she invented a lot of her own mythology. Whereas I think we've got plenty of our own to build stories from. It was only a few days ago that I was speaking to somebody about this talk I'm giving, actually, and he just happened to say, yes, we used to talk about old Tom of the pit in Meatball, and if you went swimming in there, he grabbed your legs. I hadn't even heard that before. That was one that was new to me, but something which he'd heard in his childhood. So I think there's a lot of scope to dig further into this mythology and see what else we can find, and take those stories, keep spreading them, and make something new with them. I'm going to stop sharing now because that brings the slides to the end. So now I'll press new share instead of stop sharing is what I've done. Stop share. There we go. So thank you for listening.